Welcome to the Inspire Health Podcast. Your life is about to get a whole lot better. Have you ever felt like you tried everything and yet still couldn't find the answers or the solutions that you were seeking? Whether you're dealing with chronic illness, physical or emotional pain, I want you to know that your body is the most sophisticated machine on planet Earth. Your body holds unfathomable wisdom. Trust in it and learn from it. Know that there are answers and there are solutions to your specific health challenges. And we will be uncovering all of them here on the Inspire Health Podcast. I'm so excited to be a part of your healing journey. Your transformation starts now.
Hi everybody, welcome back to the Inspire Health Podcast. In today's episode, I want to talk about key nutrient balances that may be exacerbating your anxiety, depression, and worry. Now, I have had a huge amount of people dealing with lots of anxiety and stress and depression over this last while, and part of this has been just because it has been such a crazy year and there is so many things that are going on that are pushing our buttons. But one thing that a lot of times people completely forget about is to take a deeper dive to see if there's any additional reasons that could be exacerbating these feelings that we're experiencing. And looking at targeted nutrients in the body play a really big impact on how we think and how we feel. And sometimes what happens is there is these background biochemical imbalances that have been there sometimes our entire life that just add an extra log to the fire when our environment starts to get to be really challenging and stressful or depressing or anxiety provoking. But if we've got these background biochemistry that is challenged or a little bit out of balance, then that can just be adding a lot of fuel to the fire. So I want to break down this topic because this is something that a lot of people have concerns about currently, and this is one of the missing links in my mind that should always be assessed. Now, when we look at anything to do with mental health, there's several areas that we need to address. And these are the big players when I think about mental health. First, there's gut health and nutrition. So this is stuff like, how is our microbiome, the bacterial flora in our gut? Are we managing blood sugar and stabilizing that well? Do we have any food intolerances or food sensitivities or anything that might be tweaking things? These types of things are all part of the stuff that we need to look at. And blood sugar regulation probably being one of the main ones. Another one is the mind, body, spirit. And this is an area that I work a lot with, and this is looking at, are we processing and digesting emotions properly, or are they getting this buildup of this neurochemistry in the body that we're just not breaking down and metabolizing? Are we making sense of what is coming up in our world? Are we able to learn lessons from what it is that the world is showing us? All of these sorts of areas. Now, this can also incorporate things like cognitive behavioral therapy and ways of working with changing our thinking and our beliefs, and all of this stuff ties under mind, body, spirit. Now, another area that's important is self-regulation, and self-regulation is basically looking at how well are we able to regulate our autonomic nervous system, that system that deals with either fight or flight or rest and digest. Can we get out of fight or flight and into rest and digest so that we can regulate our world much more effectively? And then the one I want to talk about today, and I'm going to take a specific piece of this that I think is very important, is advanced nutrient therapy. And this is most of the work from the groundbreaking research from Dr. William Walsh in his book Nutrient Power: Heal Your Biochemistry and Heal Your Brain. And Dr. Walsh runs the Walsh Research Institute out of Chicago. I've done training with him several times, and I really found his work to be a missing link when we talk about anything to do with mental health. Basically, his approach is looking at nutrients that play very pivotal roles in our biochemistry that regulate how we think, feel, and ultimately behave. And he's done this work over close to 40 years now. And I'm going to go through this, he has a massive chemistry database. They have laboratory testing of over 30,000 mental health patients and controls. There's more than 3 million chemical test assays and results for patients diagnosed with everything from schizophrenia, depression, ADHD, anxiety, autism, behavioral and learning disabilities. It's a huge resource and wealth of information that has been well researched. And the premise is that there is biochemical individuality and that humans are genetically and epigenetically diverse. Now, when we say epigenetically, this is a big topic over the last while, and there's a big difference between what our genes say and then how they actually respond to the world around us and what impacts them to literally turn them on or turn them off, so to speak. So, epigenetics is the science of essentially what is affecting our genes to turn our genes on or turn our genes off. And what we used to think was that genetics basically ran the show. Whatever you were given for genetics, sorry, that was what you got, and end of story. And now we know that really about 95% of what goes on in our body is more epigenetic, meaning how we interact with the world around us, what foods we eat, if we're moving our body, how we manage stress. All of these types of things tend to play a very big role when it comes to what turns on and turns off different genes from behaving in a certain way. And because of the genetics and epigenetics, most people are deficient in several nutrients and overloaded in others. And when we are able to break those down and take a look at it, we can figure out what's going on and then we can start to make some corrections. The good news around all of this is that there's really fewer than about a dozen nutrient imbalances that dominate mental disorders. So it's not like out of these hundreds of different types of nutrients that we hear about, there's really about a dozen that ultimately impact us the most severely. And these key nutrients are essential for either neurotransmitter synthesis or regulation. So neurotransmitters, these are things like serotonin and dopamine and GABA and norepinephrine. And for the most part, nutrients play a very targeted role in the production of these neurotransmitters or in the regulation of them. So ultimately, the ability to make them and the ability to utilize them. And initial lab testing and clinical treatment focus on these factors when we approach things from this point of view. Now, nutrients are extremely powerful. A lot of times people think that you need to have a strong medication in order to make a big impact on mental health. And that's not necessarily true at all. There are times where medications can be beneficial, but for the most part, you got to remember all of these nutrients are cofactors in the smooth running of many different biochemical reactions that go on in the body. And if they are out of balance, they will wreak havoc. So how are nutrients so powerful? Well, first they play a very important role in the synthesis of neurotransmitters. So like I said, they play a very big role in the production of serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, GABA, and a number of others. And these neurotransmitters play a big role in how we feel. They also can play a big role in the epigenetic regulation of gene expression. So like I said, some genes can be turned on or turned off depending on what nutrients that we are taking in, whether we have too much of one or not enough of one. They can both create different troubles. And they can impact on neurotransmitter reuptake processes. So when you think about neurotransmitters, there's sort of two big phases. First, you have to make them. So you have to have the raw ingredients and you have to have the cofactors to actually to fuel the reactions to actually make things like serotonin, dopamine, GABA, and everything. And then once you've made them, the next phase that needs to happen is then you have to sort of spit them out. So this one neuron comes to the end, it has to spit out the neurotransmitters, and then they literally have to sit in this synapse or this bucket long enough to activate the neuron beside it. And we also know that nutrients can play a very big role in how long these neurotransmitters sit in this bucket, and they need to stay there long enough to activate the next neuron. So if they're getting sucked up too quickly, we can't utilize them very well. Or if they stay there for too long, then we get an overexpression of them, and that can create troubles as well. So pretty important all around. And then the last thing that's really important around the power of nutrients is that they play a very important role in the protection against oxidative stress. Now, oxidative stress is like that rusting effect that tends to go on in everybody's body that we associate with aging. So anything that has to do with oxidative stress is not very good if it's in too much, and nutrients can play a very powerful role in mitigating that type of a reaction. Now, when we're looking at neurotransmitters, you want to be in balance. So too much or too little both create a lot of troubles. The key is to really figure out where you are and then start to try and get them into the right balance for your biochemistry so that your mood and energy and ability to interact with the world is as optimal as possible. Now, the one I want to talk about today is a copper overload. So, copper is a really important nutrient in the body, and it plays into many different reactions. And one of the things that can happen for many people is that we can end up having too much copper. And there's sort of two things that go on with copper and I'll explain how it creates troubles and what some of the symptoms are like if you have a copper overload. But think of it this way, the two things are that first, copper needs to be balanced very effectively with zinc. Zinc and copper are teeter-totter nutrients, and they need to be in the right balance. And for the most part, for optimal brain function, you really need to have copper and zinc about equal amounts. And we look at these and we know what the reference ranges are like, and we know where the optimal zones are supposed to be. But many times there's a big imbalance, and zinc goes down and copper goes up. And so part of it is that you want copper and zinc to be closer to a one-to-one relationship, and if that gets really skewed where copper is much higher than zinc, that can start to cause some troubles. The other thing is sometimes just if copper is too high, and there's a difference between bound copper and free copper. And if you don't have enough of a key nutrient called ceruloplasmin, which basically binds copper, then one of the other problems is that you can have too much free copper bumping around, and it's the free copper that aggravates a reaction that can actually create a whole lot of different troubles. So when we're looking at this, we're looking for your ratio of copper and zinc, and we're looking for the amount of free copper that's just bumping around basically in your brain, causing some troubles. So many patients with mental illness have a genetic tendency to elevated copper levels. So it's not necessarily that you're just taking in too much copper from your environment. Now you could be. If you have copper pipes, that would be something that you would want to change. But for the most part, most of these things, like Dr. Walsh had mentioned, are epigenetic. A lot of these things are just tendencies that are passed down family trees from generations. And we know that epigenetics can pass down up to 13 different generations. So if you go through your family tree, you might see different members of the family that have actually dealt with many different aspects of mental health, whether they have had anxiety or an eating disorder or ADHD or depression or psychosis or any of these types of things. You look down the family tree, and if there's a history of that, and you're dealing with certain things like this, there's a good chance that there is a susceptibility that has been passed down through the epigenetics. And those things can be worked with very effectively with nutrients. So we see that a lot of these patients that deal with some of these different issues like anxiety and ADHD and depression have a genetic tendency to elevated copper levels. And this can predispose them to a number of different psychiatric disorders. And I don't even use the term psychiatric disorders really in clinic. I'm mostly just looking to see what's going on in the person's world, all of those factors that we talked about at the very beginning, and then I just want to know what's going on with the biochemistry, because ultimately each person is going to react in a slightly different way to the different biochemistry. You could have a couple of people that have a copper overload, and one of them could have very bad ADHD, and another one could have severe anxiety, and another one could have depression from it. So it depends on how it plays out in that person's body. But nutrient therapy can assist in normalizing the key imbalances that take place. When we look at a copper overload, the big imbalances occur with two primary neurotransmitters called dopamine and noradrenaline or norepinephrine. And what I love about nutrient therapy is that for the most part it's relatively inexpensive and it has very few side effects, unlike a lot of times when we have to use heavier medications. So what's going on with a copper overload? So copper is a catalyst, and this is what I want everybody to understand, is that why nutrients are so powerful is because they are often cofactors or catalysts to key biochemical reactions that go on in the body, literally like billion times a second in every cell in the body. So you need to have the right amounts of them in the right balance to have everything run smoothly. So on the PowerPoint here, I've got a picture of a biochemical reaction where dopamine normally gets converted into norepinephrine. Now, dopamine is that neurotransmitter that's generally associated with pleasurable feelings. It's associated with focus. It's associated with attention. So when dopamine starts to go down, we don't feel very good. We tend to increase more addictive behaviors because we're wanting that next dopamine hit. Our focus and attention starts to decrease. And not only does it go down, but if you have too much copper, you're basically catalyzing this reaction. So you're speeding the reaction up. You're increasing the conversion of dopamine into norepinephrine. So with high copper, you shunt that reaction. Your dopamine gets lower and lower, and your norepinephrine goes up and up. So think of it this way: your ability to focus, concentrate, seek pleasure situations, feel calm and good inside your body starts to go down, whereas your norepinephrine, which is basically like a precursor to making adrenaline, or it's kind of like adrenaline in the brain almost, it's going up and up. So that fight or flight is kind of going up and up. That's where usually the anxiety or the hyperactivity can come from. Now, some of the big common symptoms that have been found over the decades of work when Dr. at the Walsh Research Institute have found, these are some of the big ones. And you don't have to have all of these by any means, but if you have some of these, and this is something that's been persisting, this would be a really important one to check out to see if it's something that's on the table. Because if it is, it can be worked with very well through nutrient therapy. So copper overload symptoms would be things like severe anxiety. Often people deal with a lot of sleep disorders and trouble sleeping, waking up at night, hard to go to sleep. Hormonal imbalances. Copper is very tied with estrogen. So if you're on the birth control pill, a lot of times copper levels will go up along with it. They tend to follow estrogen levels. And we see often aggravations for a lot of women when their period starts, PMS, perimenopause, and postpartum. And it's associated very much with hormonal imbalances with women. It's also associated with hyperactivity in childhood. People can get skin sensitivity to metals and rough fabrics. This is a lot of times I'll find with kids that have, not just kids, adults too, but I'll see this with kids a lot. When I'm seeing kids that have a copper imbalance, it's not uncommon that they are needing to always cut the tags off on the back of their shirts. It's like certain fabrics and sensation on their skin just drive them crazy. And they can also be sensitive to a lot of different metals. There can be more reactions on the skin from some of these things. Sometimes we can even hear or get ringing in the ears. People can get tinnitus. There can be estrogen intolerance, and very, very common with postpartum depression. So if you're a woman and you are dealing with some postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety, extremely important to get your copper zinc levels checked. Copper normally doubles during pregnancy because it's really important for copper levels to be elevated for the neurovascularization for the child. So you need to have it go up. But if after delivery, copper then should start to come back down and normalize. And in a lot of women that deal with postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety, the problem is that they have a susceptibility where they just can't get rid of copper so easily. So the copper tends to stay up. And then as the copper stays up, it pushes that reaction of converting dopamine to norepinephrine. So you're getting that low dopamine, higher norepinephrine, which can definitely trigger anxiety and depression for a lot of people. And I've had patients with postpartum depression come in where their copper levels have been 3 times higher than what it should be. And once they normalize the heaviness, which so often just gets attributed to being a new mom, not sleeping well, being stressed, all of those things, which definitely add to it. But again, you can't just take that and leave everything else. This has been well documented to be associated with postpartum depression. Other symptoms can be learning disabilities or poor grades in school. White spots on the fingernails can often, so you'll look at the fingernails and you usually see these little white specks often that are on the fingernails. That's also a sign of low zinc. And emotional meltdowns and frequent anger. So think about it. You don't have the biochemistry to regulate mood very well. So you're not just over emotional if you are having meltdowns or frequent anger, but you don't have the biochemistry to be able to regulate your mood very effectively. And when that starts to get balanced back out again, it can make a really big difference. Also associated with poor immune system because low zinc levels, which are associated with high copper levels. Low zinc is really important. Zinc is a very important nutrient for immune system function, so a really big one for that. And poor concentration and focus, like I talked about. I think they found about almost in one of the outcome studies that the Walsh Research Institute did, they found that close to 75% of the kids with learning disabilities with ADHD all had a copper zinc imbalance. And I see that one all the time. So if any of those symptoms sit with you, or if you're dealing with some of that stuff, if your anxiety and depression has been if you've had a history of some of that but has been really blown up the last while, getting this stuff checked and balancing some of that stuff out just might pull one big log out of the fire that lets you start to manage the rest of your world that much better. So I hope this information helps. If you want more information on this, feel free to go to my website, go to media. I've got episodes on anxiety, depression, on ADHD that break a lot of this down and much more. I will go through some other nutrient imbalances that also play big roles in all of this. Copper zinc is just one of them, but it's one of the most important ones that we check routinely on people when they're going through these symptoms. All right, everybody, take care, and I hope this helps. And if you have any questions, please write into me. I would love to hear from you.
Well, that was awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to invest in your health and well-being. Since this podcast is brand new, reviews and subscribers are so vital for us to get off the ground and share this really important information. So if you found this information valuable, please post a review and subscribe to the podcast so you'll get our newest episodes. Also, if you know of someone who would benefit from this, please share it with them. You can also find us on Instagram at #InspireHealthPodcast. If you have a question that you'd like to be addressed, direct message me on Instagram or leave a comment on one of my posts. I would love to hear from you. And you can grab our show notes and free resources for each episode at inspirehealthpodcast.com. So be sure to go online and check it out.